Old people can get set in their ways, can get mentally as well as physically brittle. They can tell themselves that they know it all already, have seen it all before, and instead of struggling against the hardening of the arteries and the ossification of ideas, they can become as stubborn and willful as children who don't know anything, and with often the same harmful results. When I think about an old person who has managed to adapt to life's changes, big and small, and stay ahead and keep in step, I think about that grand old vaudevillian and cigar-smoking joker and singer, admirer of beautiful women, George Burns. George Burns started out in show business before the days of talkie pictures, touring the vaudeville stage circuit with his wife and comedy partner Gracie Allen. Together, they joked their way from the stage to the movies and to the radio. Later, when television came along, the George Burns and Gracie Allen show was one of the great ones, running every week for years and years. Until one day, Gracie Allen died, leaving George Burns alone in the world with only his cigar, a trunk full of gag lines, a few $1 million in the bank, and a lot of great memories. Did Burns retire after his wife's death? Did he crawl off and play golf until the Grim Reaper came for him? No. Burns wrote himself a new act, a new set of monologues. He made a new career in the movies and basically reinvented himself. He continued to crack jokes and pursue lucrative movie and television roles and personal appearances. He made a career out of being old, and he didn't do that by being inflexible, you can bet. I think it was a great American novelist and keen observer of his fellow man who remarked that old people are on the same side of life as children and animals, and that they can see things regular people do not. Well, old people and children as well as animals can get so set in their ways that nothing, not even the survival instinct, will change them. I mentioned earlier about the little girl who would only eat a certain way. Well, old people too often get fussy about their food. They also get particular about what people talk about in front of them, and who performs those little services that old people and babies often require, like feeding and sometimes even changing diapers. It's uncomfortable to think about our bodies turning on us this way, but it doesn't do to be rigid and say that we'll never get old and set our minds into some hardened position so that we cannot accept help when it's needed and offered. That would be the kind of pride that destroys a person just as surely as walking into speeding traffic saying to yourself, the pedestrian has the right of way. True, but tell that to the ambulance attendant. Flexibility and compromise are at the center of democracy and the American way of life. In private life, there are places where you can be unyielding if you want to be, and only you will profit or suffer because of your firmness. In the national arena of politics, however, with so many different groups holding so many different and often uncompromising positions, the only way for government to work is to declare all things are negotiable and talk everything out to find some path acceptable to all parties, if not satisfactory to any of them. That's why our forefathers, when they drew up the Constitution of the United States, made religion and government completely separate. You can't compromise in matters of religion, and you'd be a hypocrite or worse if you did. So the Founding Fathers set all those things where people really can't be expected to compromise off to the side, for other theaters than political theater, for other contests than contests of public policy. There was an American statesman, Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was known as the Great Pacifier and the Great Compromiser. Clay served in the United States Senate, in Congress, and was Secretary of State under President John Quincy Adams. Clay both incited the War of 1812 and helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent that settled the war. Pursuing a consistent policy of reconciling the conflicting interests of the nation during the time of the great westward expansion, he ramrodded the Missouri Compromise and helped enact the National Road. As a presidential candidate, Clay said that he would rather be right than be president, and he certainly never did become president. Whether or not he was right, I couldn't say, but I suppose he felt that he was right, and that right meant finding a common path to an agreed-upon end. A wise and flexible old gentleman used to dine every month in his club downtown, sitting at a long table covered with a white linen tablecloth and silver candlesticks, and served by tuxedoed waiters, loved to regale companions with the fruits of his many years of experience. After dessert and coffee were served, he would push back from the table and light an enormous imported cigar. This cigar is the only indulgence of an old man, he would say with a chuckle, as he struck the wooden match against his thumbnail. And then he'd launch into one of his stories. They usually began with a question, such as, "Did I ever tell you about the time when I was setting up factories for the giant XYZ Corporation in the backwoods of Georgia and was compelled to teach them a little lesson in business and good manners?" Although the stories always started out the same, no two stories were ever alike, and there would always be a wealth of wisdom through example, a veritable mother lode of remarkable instruction. Well, this old man, who was so old and so wise and so flexible, has one ironclad rule for dealing with other people. This rule involved never being the first to break a bargain, and always assuming that what happened before should not happen again. He said, "If a man fools me once, I think that's not nice, and I remember it. And if the same man fools me a second time, I think, shame on you. If the same fellow tricks me a third time, well, I have been warned and should have changed my ways and didn't, and I think, shame on me." Here's a little rhyme to remind you of this wisdom. Fool me one, that's not nice. Fool me two, shame on you. Fool me three, shame on me. Let's suppose that there's a vast, hugely powerful force that nobody can withstand. And this immense force is always active and in furious motion. It never rests. It's like a slowly flowing river that can eventually carve the Grand Canyon out of solid rock. But that comparison doesn't really do it justice. The force I'm talking about is much more formidable than any river or ocean or glacier or any other natural phenomenon. Now, in trying to achieve your life's goals, would you prefer to fight against this great force? Would you want to struggle against this mighty power that has all the odds overwhelmingly in its favor? Or would you rather enlist this great power in your cause and make the inevitable work for you instead of against you? Take your time before answering. Think it over. By the way, time is that great power I'm talking about. Time is the mightiest force in the world, or even in the universe. Of course, the answer to the question I posed is very obvious. Why would you ever choose to fight time when you could have time on your side? Who wouldn't want to harness the great river of time that flows through all of life? Why wouldn't you want to use the power of time to generate power in every area of your existence, to turn the turbines of your hopes and dreams, to charge your every aspiration with lightning bolts of electricity? Well, there is only one way to make time work for you, not against you, and that's with patience. There have been some items in the news lately about changes in the climate, global warming and so forth, and how the level of the seas will rise during the coming years and put whole communities under water that now stand high and dry. All I can tell you is that in certain parts of the country, it's been plenty hot and dry the last few summers, and I'm sure there have been times when the residents of those areas would have liked to have seen some big ocean waves come rolling across the plains. Think for a moment about any state that's in the middle of this continent, away from the coast, and ponder this question. What do you suppose it would take to turn that state into a kind of surfer's paradise? So when it gets hot, you could just go out and let the waves cool you off. For example, what would you need in order to turn Texas into California? If you take the perspective of an engineer, you'd maybe think about the water rights, the dams, and all the good stuff you'd need. The kind of undertaking that would make the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead look like a little inflatable backyard swimming pool. From that perspective, the whole notion's not only impractical, it's impossible. But if you believe everything that's been written about global warming and rising water, you realize that it isn't really an impossible proposition. In fact, some people are saying it's inevitable. You don't need any water rights or dams to see it happen either. All you need is patience. Here's another illustration of the power of patience. Imagine you're at a cottage in New England when a blizzard hits. There's more snow in less time than any other winter on record. If you went to bed in the middle of this blizzard, you'd probably assume that when you got up, you'd have to shovel the drifts away from the front door just to get down the steps. You may even think about getting started on the work before you go to bed. But in this case, as it turns out, all that bedtime effort wouldn't have been necessary. Overnight, the wind keeps blowing, and while you sleep, it shifts around 180 degrees. So all the snow on your front porch is cleared away naturally. You don't have to knock yourself out with a shovel. You may be saving yourself from a stiff back or a heart attack. And all you had to do was wait. Patience.